Hey there. I just finished reading a book called Capitalizing Religion, Ideology and the Opiate of the Bourgeoisie, written by Craig Martin. And I thought I'd make a quick video on this book because I think it really brought up for me a lot of prescient ideas when considering individualized religion, peak capitalism, modernity, the secular, the religious, etc. So not just considering the individual, but considering unique religious choices and how they reflect a capitalist agenda in the world we currently inhabit. So Craig Martin is a professor of religious studies. Some of his other books, like Masking Hegemony and Discourse and Ideology, look really, really good as well. So I'm going to add them to my reading list, so maybe we can do more videos in the future. All right, so when it comes to capitalizing religion, I'm going to be focusing on part one of this book, as it focuses most clearly on Martin's own critical theory. And part two focuses more on identifying examples and case studies of this capitalism-based spirituality. So the second section is good, but I really like the first section and the theory more. I mean, it's straight fire. So I'll be quoting from Martin's book at length, and then we're going to shift gears in this video and use some of John Milbank's work and radical orthodoxy as well to further elucidate the point here. So this is going to be pretty surface level because Milbank's theory really deserves other videos to go more further into depth with that. So basically the book Capitalizing Religion looks at the long slide of what we would consider participation in collective, organized, established religion to the camp of spiritual but not religious and pick and choose personal religions. So almost like a folk religion, right? So really this means that religion has been commodified and the petty bourgeoisie are able to consume religion as an individual and make individual choices based on that religion. So it's not just about individualism per se, because Martin writes at length in this book that the individual as we understand it does not exist. Instead, it examines the embedded capitalist agenda of individual religious action. So he's going to draw some lines explicitly from consumerism and commodification to spirituality and religion. So for Martin, religion has been intercepted and altered by capitalist ideology and consumer practices. So Martin calls this new religion, which is individualized spirituality, essentially, the opiate of the bourgeoisie. Or as he writes, describing the current religious environment, the contemporary religious world resembles a supermarket in which customers are shopping for suitable commodities that are right for them. So this brand of religion is especially accessible and enticing for the upper middle class, who often find it embarrassing to be perceived as religious and rather prefer to appropriate certain aspects of world religions in order to appear like they have a unique spiritual system, feigning wisdom, and at worst exoticizing other cultures. So again, this speaks to taking on the mantle of identity and shedding that mantle when it's convenient and then putting it back on. So in addition to the world's supermarket of religions, Martin argues a couple more points here about contemporary individual religions and its intertwining with the capitalist agenda. So I'm going to quote at length here. They naturalize or legitimate the surrender of individuals to the capitalist mode of production by promoting quietism or accommodationism through the characterization of any attempt to challenge capitalism as extremist or fundamentalist, by encouraging consumption, by emphasizing individual fulfillment or well-being as aligned with career success, or by promoting increased worker productivity. Also, he writes, the discourses on individual religion tend to envision individuals in isolation, rather than as subjects interpolated and thereby brought into existence through ideologies and discourses. As such, they block structural analysis by obfuscating the extent to which subjects in a capitalist system are determined by social norms outside their control. So additionally, Martin writes, like all rhetoric, the rhetoric of individualism has the effect of sanctioning some social agendas over and against others. And the individualism inherent in these discourses in particular functions, intentionally or not, to legitimate career aspirations and consumer choice, and, more importantly, to obfuscate the extent to which capitalist social structures are constitutive of apparently free individual choices. So what about the conundrum of the individual in modern capitalist society? So this book argues, to put it bluntly, and this is quoting Martin, that the problem with individualism is not that it is corrosive on community or social solidarity, but that it doesn't exist. For reasons that will become clear later in the work, there are no individuals, and even in societies where the ideology of individualism prevails. So Stephen Lukes, a social theorist, suggests individuals always turn out on inspection to be social and indeed historically specific. So Martin writes, and I'm going to quote just at length here, the problem with the ideology of individualism is not that it dissolves community, but that it obscures how individuals are constituted by their communities. Telling people that they are free to consume commodities or cultures in whatever they wish does not make them autonomous. Rather, it obfuscates how their apparently free choices are determined by the social fields that limit, reward, and penalize their choices. Being an individual does not mean, as liberal social theories might have it, being autonomous from social constraints. On the contrary, society and social constraints are constitutive of what an individual is or becomes. Rather, what it means to be individual is only that one is increasingly different from other individuals. To take up religion and secular as academic tools would be as problematic as using orthodoxy and heresy as analytical tools to describe the rise of Christendom. Like primitive and savages, they are tools of war, useful for drawing lines in the sand, for gerrymandering social space, or for scoring points against opponents. They are insufficient for reflexive attempts to theorize how groups imagine themselves into existence. So much of what others call individual religion, I will argue, this is Martin speaking, this is a quote from him, is a specific strand of capitalist ideology, a strand that obscures the causes of individual choice while encouraging individuals to produce, consume, and accommodate themselves to the regnant mode of production. He continues on. Regnant ideologies, those ideologies labeled as religious, will be unable to attain an uncontested hegemonic status in societies where capitalist ideologies and practices are dominant, particularly because economic empires function through the inclusion of diverse ideologies only on the condition that such ideologies remain subordinate to the central economic functions of the empire. So continuing, Christian maximalism, i.e. the European Middle Ages, he specifically uses, have been replaced by capitalist maximalism today. Capitalism orders the lives of minimalist Christians more than Christianity does. So he basically explains in this book that there's been a shift from Christian maximalism to minimalism. And so Christian minimalists are essentially those who participate in a church, but it's not the central focus of their life. So continuing on, Martin writes, what fathers preach but do not practice will be internalized by the sons as a system of rhetoric rather than as a system of ultimate significance. At the extreme point of such a development, supposing that the official cosmological model is unadjusted, we find a situation in which everybody is still socialized into the official model of religion, but the model is not taken at face value by anybody. Religious beliefs will be compartmentalized into opinions, which will have no direct relation to the individual's effective priorities in everyday conduct. This leads subjects to have a sense of autonomy. The individual does not escape the consciousness-shaping effect of institutional norms to a considerable extent. However, this sense of autonomy may be merely illusory. So the consumer orientation also pervades the relation of the autonomous individual to the sacred cosmos. With the pervasiveness of the consumer orientation and the sense of autonomy, the individual is more likely to confront the culture and the sacred cosmos as a buyer. So this leads to pick and choosing. How it belongs to a dominant folk theory of religion that dovetails well with consumerism under late capitalism. So this again speaks to the idea that you can participate in religion up to an extent, or you can pick and choose the ways that you want to participate in religion and encounter religion. So continuing on reading Martin, the experience and institution distinction is a building block of a modern domesticated ideology of the status quo, which has incarnations in both modern spirituality and liberal forms of Christianity. So hold that point, and I'm going to switch gears here a little bit. I'm going to be drawing some parallels, as I had mentioned at the beginning of the video, from John Milbank's The Future of Love, Essays in Political Theology, which is just a collection of his essays, and a bit of other writings of his as well. So I will cite this as I go. Basically, we're going to use some of his thoughts on society and the secular. And so I'm going to focus mainly on this idea of what it is to be considered the secular, and the belief that we are inhabiting a secular society, which would give rise to the ability of individual spirituality, essentially, through capitalism. So quoting from Milbank in The Future of Love, and I'm going to do this at length here. Only what is sacred, what possesses a value that reason cannot fully fathom, that which therefore is validated only by models of usually religious tradition, is truly immune from commodification. So a secular liberal left is unable metaphysically to validate even its own liberalism because its abandonment of any belief in the spiritual reality of mind or soul leaves it with only a sham belief in either freedom or ideals worth struggling for. So he's explaining this this difference between essentially what we would consider the secular and the sacred. So reading on from Milbank, only the general embrace of a realist metaphysics of transcendence can render this possible. So just quickly here, metaphysics deals with sort of the first principles of being, knowing, substance, identity, etc. So think about the nature of existence itself, what does and does not exist. So you can look at Adorno as well here for good understanding of metaphysics post-Holocaust. So reading on from Milbank, indeed its subjectivism, emotionalism, restrictive puritanism, iconoclasm, and opposition to high culture owe more in the end to the Reformation than they do to the Enlightenment. So these attitudes are all powerless to resist capitalism and bureaucracy because both are profoundly promoted by the mainstream Protestant legacy. This is key here. Milbank writes, only a Catholic center more extreme than either of the extremes, we're talking about conservative and liberal in this instance, because it points metacritically to a different plane, so metaphysically speaking, which can think and act its way out of our current heretical, immoral, and neo-pagan political morass. So the political conundrum that we're in right now, right? So what does a Catholic center even mean? Basically, with the recession of religion in society, religion acting as a foundation of society, there's been a loss of solidarity and identity. And so in the place of religion as the foundation, Milbank believes that major secular ideologies have failed, and liberal democracy, in a way, has failed as well, especially in regard to morals. So right now we are existing in an ideological vacuum, and ideologized iterations of religion are rushing in to fill this. So in America, think the extreme right-wing iteration of evangelical Christianity that has really come to prominence over the past 60 years, let's say. So Milbank at every turn refutes Protestantism in favor of Catholicism. So this is important to the prior quotes, mainly due to Protestantism's dovetailing with capitalism and individualism. So I'm grossly paraphrasing here, obviously, but you get the point of what I'm saying. So here's something Milbank wrote in an essay that will legitimate this claim. So capitalism was partially enabled by a deviational, individualist, voluntarist, and nominalist form of Christianity beginning before Protestantism, and then finding its main vehicles not only in Protestantism, but also in the vast Suarezian inheritance, and also in the Cartesianism and Jansenism, excuse me. So also in this, there's the myth, basically, that the secular even exists, right? So according to Milbank, a secular society isn't viable, and the only choice is solely between religion and nihilism. So religion becomes a way of life rather than something one chooses to participate in. And without it, existence loses meaning. So it is a return to an authentic faith rather than the spirituality, rather than the spiritually flattened world that we have found ourselves in when we think about individualized modern religion and modernity and capitalism. So God is transcendent of everything, and to ignore this is to miss the big picture. So in regard to the lack of the secular, Milbank writes in Theology and Social Theory, and I quote, "And the appearance of the secular is not merely a matter of removing something superfluous, as sociology generally tells it in its theories of desacralization, the image of the stripping of a sacred covering so that some realm of pure humanity and nature is brought into the open. That portrayal assumes that there is such a thing as a pure humanity, which is always there under the surface of the sacred and of religion, which has nothing to do with the sacred, and it assumes that humanism is the natural destiny of history, the inevitable telos toward which all human societies move. So both of these assumptions must be contested, according to Milbank. And so I'm going to quote at length here from someone named Peter Leithart, who studied under Milbank, and he was writing this for a website called Mere Orthodoxy. So the patristic and medieval secular was a time, the period between the fall of Adam and the final advent of Christ. All of human life during this era is secular, the church as much as the state. Under seculum, perfect peace cannot be achieved. Coercive measures and warfare are still necessary. People are born, live, excuse me, decay, and die. Comprehensive as it is, the Christian secular is an intrusion into the good creation, and it will one day be folded into a new heavens and new earth. So continuing on from Leithart, modern thinkers spatialize the secular, conceiving of it as a space permanently marked off from the religious or sacred sphere. Conversely, secular reason privatizes the sacred. By bounding off religion, theorists construct a public sphere in which religious or moral considerations have no place, a public sphere dominated by power and profit. So for moderns, the spatialized secular is believed to be natural, not in a scholastic sense, according to which nature participates in the eternal law of God, but in a Grotian sense. Even if God did not exist, the natural laws of the universe would exist and could be known. So in an interview with the other journal on the topic of the choice between religion and nihilism, Milbank writes, and I quote, "Nihilism is not necessarily irrational, but it's the rational denial of the ultimacy of reason. Because in the end, there is nothing. There isn't even reason. I think capitalism is deeply aligned with nihilism in that kind of way, that if you're insisting that we need to pursue substantive ends, what Marxist calls use value, yes, there's a sense in which capitalism is irrational." So I really hope that in exploring all of these quotes and different authors that I'm making sense and how I'm linking these thoughts together. So as I was thinking about putting this video together, I found another interview that Milbank did with University of London Goldsmiths, where he was asked about essentially the future of Christendom. And he said, and I quote, "My faith would certainly be that the church would never be destroyed, even if it's reduced to a minority. Other than that, I think the situation we're in at the moment is that there's a strongly emerging Christianity in many parts of the world, in China, for example," he says, "and that there are some signs of a reviving Christian culture and intellectual tradition in Europe as well. So in the face of an otherwise increasingly superficial and vacuous culture, if those two factors can coalesce, then I think there's a possibility of the emergence eventually of something like a global Christian order. It is not impossible. But I think unless a kind of world Christendom occurs, then the future will be dark beyond our wildest expectations." So from another essay, Milbank writes, "We then need to call that the history of fallen humanity is necessarily a history of increasing catastrophe, despite the counter-history of redemption. However, we may suppose that to proceed." And so I want to take a bit of time to unpack this, because the word Christendom often really gets the boogeyman treatment when we're living in a post-Christendom world, essentially. So we're literally in the fever pitch of the crisis of modernity, and mainstream society is vacuous, empty, immoral, licentious. I could go on, but I think you understand what I'm getting at here. Christendom at its core is a world in which Christianity prevails, essentially. And historically, Christendom is the world whose cultural and religious connection and identity is based in Christianity, right? So historically and politically, we can consider that Christendom was killed in the First World War with the fall of several empires, but I do not believe it was necessarily killed in any metaphysical, ontological, etc. manner. So today, basically, when you hear Christendom, you probably have an image summoned in your mind of the Deus Vult Crusade LARPers, right? Who want to return to this historical, political iteration of Christendom. Some wish to return to the Middle Ages. And in a sense, Milbank does want to return us to the medieval world, but in an ideological sense, that God is at the center of existence, and that Christianity returns to the focal point and acts as the positively guiding aspect of society. So I think what Milbank means when he is discussing the future of Christendom is one of a post-liberal social gospel society. But yes, it is a Christocentric society. However, the desire for a Christocentric society is guided by notions of a rejection of empire, loving your neighbor, laws that create a more just society. So think Jubilee year. And offer a common identity and purpose. So Milbank is a fan of socialism as well, you should know. And this is reflected through the communal ecclesia and ethics as well. So again, this is not to be confused with ultra right-wing iterations of Christianity, at least from Milbank's perspective. And we can consider here Augustine's city of God and the sort of peaceful city of Christ that prevails against the essentially godless city, of which Milbank is utilizing as well. So thinking about Christendom, Christianity really offers the meta-narrative within which all other stories and events find their meaning. This can be said about the Bible as well. So I think this is the driving factor of Milbank's Christendom. In theology and social theory, Milbank asserts the logic of Christianity involves the claim that the interruption of history by Christ and his bride, the church, is the most fundamental of events, interpreting all other events through this. And it is most essentially a social event, able to interpret other social formations because it compares them with its own new social practice. So Christianity creates the model for society, essentially. It creates the meta-narrative, as he says. And so I'm going to go back and I'm going to quote Peter Leithart again, because I think he really says it very well, much better than I can, obviously. And so I quote, as a result, the peace of the Christian city isn't the mock peace of Rome. And so this is considering Augustine's city of God. A peace achieved by counter-violence. Rather, in the spirit, the church strives toward the true peace that is absolute harmony and love, consensus in love. For Christianity, virtue is not a suppression of the passions, nor a suppression of desire, but a redirection of desire to its proper object, so sublimation here. Neither peace nor virtue rests on violence. The counter-history and counter-ethics are undergirded by a counter-ontology of peace. Unlike antiquity and postmodernism, Christianity does not view difference as inherently conflicted, but rather recognizes the difference as the condition for the possibility of communion and harmony. The ultimate reality is the triune God. Love that. Thank you, Peter Leithart. So after modernity lies a disappointment with scientific reason and natural law, leaving only a formalistic nihilism as their pale echo. So I'll end on something else Milbank wrote in an essay entitled The Body of Love Possessed. The Christian confidence in its ethical tradition is peculiarly strong because we claim that in the life of Christ we have already a concrete definition of a perfect social reality, which nevertheless, in its to-be-realized fullness, we can only imperfectly sketch out. So for Milbank, the Christian ecclesia's very specificity consists in the concrete actualizing of a universal Eucharistic unity in difference. All right. I hope that video makes sense. Thanks so much for listening. I will hopefully be making some more videos in the future about John Milbank and radical orthodoxy, hopefully getting to read a little bit more of Craig Martin's writing, and making some more videos in the future. All right. Thanks so much for listening. Take care.